So I decided to start this project called iOS Code Review. It was just a Twitter account at first, and then I quickly turned it into a newsletter. And
Welcome to the TheMayankShow podcast, Marina, first of all. And I would like for you to introduce yourself to my viewers. I know they might know this newsletter called iOS Code Review, and they might also know Hybrid Cat on Twitter. But today we're going to discuss Marina. So, yeah, Marina, let's go ahead with that.
yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So yeah, my name is Marina, and let me tell you a couple of words about myself. So I've started iOS development as my first full-time job back in 2011 when I was studying at the fourth year of university. And I did some different programming before, and I studied computer science, so I got different exposure to different languages and technologies. But when it came to my first full-time job, that ended up being iOS, an iOS developer, and that was a really fate, I would say. It's a bit of an interesting story. I had a Windows phone at the time, and I did my test assignment for this mobile agency in C Sharp. Because they were like, yeah, whatever language where you could build some UI on. So I did that, and they liked my solution, and they were like, okay, we have Android and we have iOS, pick whatever you want. And I just ended up picking iOS because I knew C and C++. That was like main languages that we used in university during education, and we didn't do anything with Java at all. Then yeah, it was just like not a flip of a coin, but yeah, it was kind of just language based, and that's it. I didn't know anything about either of the platforms. And yeah, I ended up loving the platform and the concepts behind it, and kind of the way of thinking of like best practices and guidelines, and kind of being safe for the user, and so on. And I just ended up staying with it, and like growing my career in that space. And now it's been like 12 years since, and I'm still
Nice.
working with iOS development. I have done other things as well, like some web development and a little bit for the backend, and being a scrum master and lead developer and all that. But I'm still mostly working with iOS because I just love it.
Do you still do web development on the side?
So I have the skills, and I wouldn't call myself like a senior web developer. I have like
Mm-hmm.
some experience, and I often work on projects where there's both uh, yeah, a mobile client and a
Right.
web, some sort of web client as well. Could be the same, or more like of a dashboard, kind of behind the scenes type of product. And I'm comfortable contributing and like helping fix bugs and reviewing code and so on. So I would say like 5% of the time I would do web, but just because I'm curious about it.
I
And I
see.
like to kind of go a bit to different
And I
things.
think that also gives you edge when you come up with your own idea and you want to build a complete application. And I think most of the times we as iOS developers who are not that much comfortable with backend, we preferably choose Firebase. That's our first choice.
Mhm.
These days. But when you are good with web development side as well, or like if you talk about specifics as backend development, then I believe you have the whole control over the architecture of your product, not just
Mhm.
from the front end side, but from the back end side as well. Is that the
Yeah.
case or?
Yeah, I would say so. I've actually used Firebase a lot as well. I've worked on multiple projects, and I still do like client projects that use Firebase, and
Mhm.
it's a really powerful platform. It definitely saves you some time on managing your own servers, but you can still
Mhm.
end up writing quite a lot of backend code using cloud functions, and it's
Right.
Node.js, and you can write them in Python as well. So it is like quite backend ish. If you want to send like emails to your users and so on, like even if you go with writing a lot of the code on the code talking to a database in the app, you
Right.
still then have to have some logic on the kind of server side, on the cloud functions.
I see.
So that way you can kind of try some backend development
That's nice.
as well.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Going back to 2011, Marina. So you picked iOS development back then, right?
Hmm.
My question is like, and it's a very obvious question that comes to my mind. How did you start learning iOS development back then? Because today we can talk about n number of resources that are available online, but back then I don't really think apart from Apple documentation there was anything else.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
how did you
exactly.
manage to learn everything back then?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's not like obvious at all. It's a very good question. Indeed, like mostly the most of the learning came from reading official documentation.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the day, there wasn't almost any like popular blogs, or not as many as today, even like nowhere near. We had a few books going around. There was a book about Objective-C 2.0. There was a book about iOS development. But back in the day, because I was living in Russia at the time and working in Russia, there like no one was reading books in English really.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite hard, and yeah, it was just not a thing really. So there was a lot of like people were translating books, and so we had these translated versions of these books that we were reading. But you could imagine they were a bit behind, right? Because it takes a lot of work and time to translate a book into a new language. So and we didn't have so many tools available today with all the AI and whatnot, right? It was
Right.
all done by hand by people. So don't remember reading that many of those books because they were essentially getting outdated. And it was around the time when I started, when automatic reference counting was introduced and blocks were introduced, so like closures um, in Swift. And those new things weren't covered in those books because those books were like made just before, and then suddenly with iOS 4 and iOS 5 there were all these new things. So it was just documentation. And I feel that was something that gave me actually really good fundamental knowledge, because
Uh-huh.
documentation mentions a lot of the communication was really good at the time. It mentions a
It
lot of
was good at that time. What do you mean by that?
like just just the other day I'm working on this project for a client where we're using the room plan API that came
I
out
see.
in iOS 16. And like
Uh-huh.
you see a property and you click on it, there's no documentation. You go
Oh,
to the documentation or to the like header file. I mean, in Swift there's no header files, but sometimes you still go to the definition and there's some extra comment on top of the function. Like there's
right.
none of that. Um, so it's just a lot of guessing that you have to do and then testing. But back
Mhm.
in the day, you would get extensive documentation about every single, fundamental thing.
And
Like,
and what used to happen when you used to come across any blockers? Maybe you're finding difficulty in using any API. So today we can simply go ahead with Stack Overflow and
mhm,
find multiple answers to the same. Like did you use the same approach back then, or Apple had a
mhm.
support team as well
Yeah,
for that?
I've used Stack Overflow. I think the earliest question and the comments I have were like from 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So it was already around at the time, but otherwise it's just a lot of digging and figuring things out. Yeah.
I
Um,
see.
yeah, it's just, yeah. I mean, it definitely have helped me with, I have acquired a lot of like debugging and debugger and like debugging and printing and the console and all of those skills like you end up using for trying to understand what the hell is going on.
I'm
Um,
trying hard to empathize, but I'm not being able to, even think of how you guys used to manage at that point of time.
mhm,
Because when I started off, it was like Swift for 3 or something. Like
mhm,
the major change happened at that time, 2 point something, and then it was 3. So I joined at that time.
mhm.
So anything before that was like you mentioned that ARC came across the same time when you started developing.
Yeah.
So how was your experience with that, like the manual management of memory as well? How was
Um,
that transition for you?
it was like the manual memory management itself. Like looking back now, of course, it's like it's night and day, with the level of tools we have today that just take care of it. You had to be very diligent with those things, but
Right.
then at the same time, those were the problems we dealt with then. Like now we get to focus more on architecture and unit testing and, like, I don't know, pretty animations and all of these more kind of advanced things, then just these more basic needs like memory management are not so much of a
Right.
problem. But back then, I would say, and it was also an agency where a lot was put on the time and how efficient we are and how like bug free things
Mm-hmm.
are, but like not necessarily so much for maintainability long term. So there were like no unit tests. No one was writing really any unit
Okay.
tests, and there were no one was talking so much about different architectures. So it was a lot about making it work and making it
Right.
work well. And I was very new at the time, so I wasn't like understanding whether this is good or bad. This was just how it was. And so it was not uncommon to start working on the code base, inherit, like I remember taking a code base from another colleague and continuing on that, where there would be a class called core, which would have like
Okay.
10,000 lines, and it would have methods for, accessing the database, like SQLite database, like calling endpoints, like all time, so just like everything that's the main logic for the app. And then there
Right.
would be view controllers that call to this core dot something something. So it's like a singleton that has every method imaginable and every global state imaginable.
Right.
And I have had to refactor a lot of these type of projects to be more manageable, because sometimes it was just, you have 20 variables that are just like global state,
Mm-hmm.
and they're really hard to work with. And if there's a bug, it's just easier to refactor it first and then fix
Right.
it, rather than
Okay.
try to understand all the possible configurations this could be in. So I ended up getting a lot of refactoring skills from
I
those
see.
times. But that's
And-
the type of, the needs we were thinking back then. Um,
right.
Memory management and like making code that's not leaking memory, and so on, but less focused on architectures and more kind of next level things, which today are normal, but back then
Right.
that
Back
was
then, I
not.
think it was more or less like if it works, then just leave it, right? Do not care about the architecture and all that. Just make sure that it works. I
It
think that
works
was
and
the
it
number.
works well. Yeah, yeah.
Works well.
So it's
Yeah.
the end result that mattered, that it's, fast, that it's not leaking memory, so the app
Yeah.
doesn't end up crashing, or like operating system killing it, and so on and so forth. So there's no bugs and so on. But like how the code looked wasn't as important, I would say, because people were just trying to build a business around this new thing called apps, and um, just build as many apps as possible for the clients. But that was also agency work, right? So I worked in an
Right.
agency for the first 3 years, which was super great way to learn, because you get
Right.
exposed to all these different projects. Perhaps people who worked in companies that were product oriented, maybe they have experienced different things and started looking at tests and the stuff a bit earlier. But yeah, that was
I
agency
see.
life.
I think in the beginning years, even at a product-based company, if we talk about the time at which we are talking about, like 2011 or 2012, I don't think that many people, many company, be it like product-oriented or an agency, were focusing on that sector of things, which is like performance and optimization.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's what I think. I'm not having any data for that, but I think that's how things evolve, and we now care about performance and optimization a lot. But let's go back there and understand, how did you come across learning architectures, and how did you evolve as a iOS engineer after that, after working with
Mhm.
an agency in Russia?
Mhm. So
Yeah.
a lot of my experience with architectures at first, or like experience as in exposure to thinking even about those things in terms of real work. I mean, of course, in university we studied the patterns and their pros and cons and when you would use them, but it's very theoretical. So when you come to the real world, it, like, not like it doesn't apply, but you don't immediately translate that to the real world. So for me, that was two things. So first of all, refactoring these huge projects with like 10,000 lines in one class, it just asked for becoming more manageable, and I
Hmm.
just felt it. Like, it's hard to explain, but no one told me that it would be better if it's more broken down into different like modules.
I see.
But it just like I just felt that it was wrong and the other way was right. Like even if you have like you have one singleton, like this one core of 10,000 lines, you can have five, one responsible for authentication and one for like order, your basket if it's
Right.
like online ordering um, app and so on. So just like that felt just so natural that I ended up doing these things. And then later on, there came more mentoring other developers, more junior developers. And later on, I was a lead developer in a startup where we had an app with multiple like independent features. It was that
Mhm.
super app era in 2014, 15,
I
where
see.
you would get an app that has lots of different sub parts. And then that was also when Foursquare and Swarm have separated into two different apps. Facebook have separated Messenger and the other bits into separate apps. So it was a lot about reusing the code and reusing the same modules for the core kind of authentication and core things in the app, and then having the different kind of smaller modules for each feature that you could place different places, like different in different apps, but they would be kind of independent building blocks. So those things have shaped the need for modularization. Like in the startup where I was a lead developer, we had 4 iOS developers, and each of us had um, their own feature to work on that was independent of others. It was just like a menu in the hamburger menu, which was also a thing at the time.
All right.
Yeah, and then you go in and into that menu, like into that menu in the hamburger, and
Okay.
that's that feature. So it was like completely independent to like view controller kind of hierarchy and functionality from all the others.
Okay.
So it was important that multiple developers can work on it in parallel without hitting like merge conflicts in the project file or in the different files in the project, and could just independently work. So that was driven by that need. So it was not just like, oh, people are talking about these architectures, like sounds
Ah,
like it's hyped, let's do it. But it was driven by real need, and
I see.
that was good, I think, because then it motivates you to think in terms of those problems and how to solve them in the real
Right.
life
I
example
mean,
where
that's very natural, very natural way of learning and implementation as well, when nobody's forcing you to go ahead with that, right?
yeah, you just do it because it feels right for the team
Right.
and for that project. Yeah, so that
So
felt really natural to me, and yeah.
I see. I think we are running too fast on your journey. You said that at that time you were a lead iOS engineer, right? And I think I missed the journey where you started as an iOS engineer, a junior,
Mhm.
and then you became a mid-level, a senior, and then a lead. I believe
Yeah,
that
I
was
can
the
tell you how that happened. Yeah, if you're curious.
so
Sure.
let's talk more about that, because I would like people to know that how can somebody evolve as an iOS engineer. Many people sometimes ask that how can we become a senior iOS engineer, right? Becoming a
Mhm.
senior iOS engineer has become a buzzword today. Like if you want to become a senior iOS engineer, then do this or do that. But I think it's more about experiencing those things when you were working as a junior or mid level. That tends you or strives you towards becoming a senior one, right?
Mhm.
So, what was your journey becoming a mid-level or senior one back then?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. For me, it did go a bit fast, so I ended up becoming a lead developer after like 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
But I
Wow.
had a lot of programming experience before becoming an iOS developer as well, right?
Right.
So even though I started as a junior iOS developer in that company, I have had experience with languages like C, C++, C#, like um, modeling databases, Bash scripting, like Unix as a like I had Linux for like 5 years since I was like 12 or something, or 13. Like I had Linux and playing around and everything with that, just by myself. So I was really a nerd before. So um, I had like a bit of a faster start because I already had that experience from before. And like learning Objective C was easy for me because it was just like another language in my kind of belt at the time.
That's a controversial statement, but let's
Yeah,
go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. Like I loved Objective C. I mean, I ended up working with it before Swift for like 5 or 6 years, full time. Then, of course, still a little bit sometimes, but before Swift, it was full time. I loved it. Like a lot of people call it weird. I mean, of course, it is strange compared to other languages, but I loved it a lot, and really enjoyed kind of the structure of it. But anyways, I think another thing that contributed to it going a bit faster than normal is also that I worked in an agency, and during those 3 years, I've worked on like 10 different projects. Some of them were, small things like you have an existing project where you have to add a feature or like fix a few bugs. Other projects were like you get a project with 10, like those core 10,000 lines. And one of those projects I ended up supporting for a year. And so I got to do all the different refactorings and fixing and just basically owning that insane code base just by myself, and also working directly with the clients and with their like a manager from their side, like a manager owning this kind of interaction. So working directly with someone who gives you requirements saying like, okay, we want this like this, and then it's your job to make it happen basically and fix all the things and so on. That close collaboration. There was no, Scrum, Agile, like none of that existed. It was just like, let's make this feature, and when we make it, then we release it. So it was like very simple. um, yeah, and lots of different projects like that. And in the end, I ended up like not in the end, but closer to the end of my time in that agency. By the third year, I got promoted to what was called, like, it translates into senior developer, but it's more like that you are uh, like a patron to others, kind of, that you can
A
mentor.
manager,
Huh?
a manager maybe.
No, no, no. Like it literally translates to senior developer, but in
Okay,
more like, if you go to a camp and there's just like kids that are a bit older than others, so they kind of keep an eye on the smaller ones. So
monitor. Okay, you use the word, I think. All right.
yeah, so it's kind of just a bit more senior member of the team, who can mentor other developers who are newcomers. But it's not, I wouldn't call it like an official senior developer title. But it basically got me opportunities to work on projects in like a bit of an architect fashion, where I would start a project from the ground up and decide the architecture and like be given a junior developer to work with me and structure the work in a way that that developer could apply their existing skills. So give them the tasks that are manageable to their level, and also give them tasks that are a bit challenging so they can learn new things, and all in the time of also structuring the architecture and kind of being responsible for the quality of that and not just giving it to the junior developer, right? So it's an interesting challenge as well, that I got to try those things. And then on some other projects, it was a bit of a unfortunate thing. I mean, for my colleague, I had like a lead or senior developer on my team, who got sick and he was away for some months, and I was offered to take his place because, yeah, I guess I was showing promise or whatever. And then I got to work as a, like, to also take his role as a project manager type of thing on these projects. So on top of the coding, I also would have to talk with the clients and kind of be a bit more on the coordination side between the things. And
More
I
or less
thought,
like a product owner these days, right?
yeah, but it was like combined roles, so still mostly coding, but also making sure things are moving in general on the project. And that was definitely at first, like, it was feeling like above my level because the project was like architected quite nicely. Like now looking back, it had some architecture and not like one huge class, right? It had these protocols and things abstracted away, and it was not as obvious what's going on. And I had to kind of inherit that and sit and understand that without the person who wrote it, right? Without someone to ask like, hey, why is this like this, or what did you mean here, and so on. So that was definitely a challenge, but it worked out. And yeah, I guess it's all about, being given an opportunity to try something that's maybe above your pay grade at that point, but then
Makes
you
sense.
try it and it's a challenge, but you manage it, and you cope well and you do well, and then your boss, or someone who's watching over you, they see that, okay, you are good at taking these challenges, so then they promote you. So in my experience, it's more about being in that role before you are given that role officially, right? And stepping up a bit ahead of
Ah,
time.
I see. Okay. I think it's basically dependent on what type of company and what type of team you're working with, because
Mhm.
your story tells me like the main crux of how you evolved during that time was, I believe, the team, right? And then a higher leadership that was looking forward to the work that you were doing, because like in this time span, nobody gets a lead role that easily, right? But
Yeah, it's
also,
very
as you mentioned that you had experience before even starting as a development in coding, I think that contributed along with your commitment to the work. I think that
for
showed up
sure.
pretty
Yeah,
well.
yeah. And my advice to anybody looking to grow in their career faster than average would be to work in an agency at first years, because you get to work on different projects, and each project, each code base has a person or people who are, architecting it and are responsible for making these decisions and kind of applying their creative thinking to how to better structure things and how to solve like certain problems. It's not just to sit and implement features, right? It's still the whole app you're building. And compared to a bigger companies, like when you are at, I don't know, you go to work in Spotify in a small in a cross-functional team where you're responsible for the login flow, and then that's three screens you're working on and architecting. Of course, it couldn't be interesting work, but for growth, um, you get exposed to much fewer things in there. And this is one project, and how can you grow in it, right? Like, you can get promoted when maybe your other lead developer leaves and someone can take their place. But in an
True.
agency, there's a lot of projects, and if you're now on one project, then next project opens up, and you can be placed there in a bit more like bigger responsibility level on that new project. So things change more fluidly, and then you get more opportunity to try to step up the next project
Makes
and the
sense.
next project.
I think also at product oriented companies, you will find that maybe the code base that you have been given, or the whole application code base, maybe that is quite overwhelming in terms of how beautifully it has been managed for a long time. And all that learning cannot be practical for you because it has already been done, right?
True.
You can
Yeah,
also, you can only just appreciate the way that application has been built, and now you are working on a certain feature.
for sure.
Versus what you mentioned about the agency, you have the higher level control where you decide along with the team how to go about architecting it, and then deciding the design patterns and all the components, dividing them, and then working on few. So I think there's a major difference. Like, many a
Yeah.
times we think that product oriented are much better, but I completely resonate with your idea, because the first company that I also worked with was a agency. So they had a lot of projects, be it Android, iOS, and other projects as well. So in a span of just 1 year, I was given two projects. So that gave me good learning experience, I would say. Whereas when I moved to the other company, that was product based, and I stick to one or two features for next 2 years. So,
Okay. Yeah.
so, so that really matters. I completely agree with you on this. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's great. What message do you have for people if they really want to uh, manage a team, if they are getting into a stage where they have become a lead iOS engineer, maybe, right?
Mhm.
And now they may get promoted to engineering manager. What do you think? There's one or two or maybe three things that can make them switching or promoting themselves to that role.
Mhm. Mhm. Like,
Yeah.
do you mean for those who have already became become that in
That are
engineering
either in
manager, or
senior
those who want to.
and who want to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would say if your goal and dream is to become a leader, then my best advice is to act like it before you get the official role. Because like essentially for your own manager or your own boss to give you such responsibility, they would want to see that you are capable of doing it. And like I don't mean to go and boss around, people around you who are not really your subordinates yet, but rather to lead by example and show your compassion and your support to your teammates, because essentially to me that's what a good leader is. It's a person who enables their teammates to be great at their job. So it's not someone who tells them what to do or how to do, or it's not even someone who's responsible for how they do their job, but it's a support role that is basically there to remove any obstacles and let the contributors, like the individual contributors, shine in the team. So it's that support that is the main goal. And of course the other side of that coin is managing up, as they say, right? So managing your own boss and communicating with them and taking down those um, top down priorities into your, like translating them into your team. So of course you also have to show your maturity to your own uh, boss on that front, that you are able to like handle feedback, give feedback, translate high level requirements into more practical things and all of that. But also what's important a lot is how you deal with your teammates, and that you can be um, that supportive, that support for them to shine, right? Because they are doing the well, it's going to
Well
be
said.
sound silly, but they're doing the actual work, right? Like
But that
coding
makes
and
sense.
designing and everything, and building and testing, and you're there to enable them to do it well.
Right. Well said. So, what did you come across after your lead iOS engineer role at that
Mhm.
certain company?
So
Did
yeah,
you?
so in the agency, I have been there for 3 years and ended there as this kind of patron developer who had other developers who I could mentor. So I wasn't their manager, and then this agency was getting transformed into a startup company. It was a bit of a complicated story, but it was basically a lot of the same people and the same teammates, just now placed in a different company, uh, building our own products. And we had an app, or like a startup, that we were building for a year
I see.
with similar people. Some people were the same and some were new, but mostly it was same people that worked in that agency. So we ended up assembling a team of around 15 people. So there was 4 iOS developers and 4 Android developers, and a couple of designers and like 3 backend developers. And so I was a natural choice for the lead iOS developer role, for structuring the work of the team and architecting the project, and yeah, basically figuring out how we can divide the work between the 4 of us and how to make it so we can code and work on all the features kind of in parallel. It wasn't very MVP. It was very much, this is everything we want to build, let's just build all of it, which was not the right approach, but that's what we knew at the time, or the management of this startup knew at the time.
So tell me one thing. If you had to take a different approach today for the same scenario, what would that
Yeah.
be?
Yeah, so for the business, it would definitely be to build sub parts, like smaller parts of the app, and validate whether that is something that the users take on, and then build more on top of that once the user base
Okay.
grows and the demands grow. But what that was completely the opposite. Let's like build everything we came up with, and of course we ended up scoping out some things, but essentially you could have scoped out 90% of it, even more. um, And then in the end, the investor didn't want to spend too much time on the marketing or too much money on the marketing. I was like, yeah, I guess it's not growing as fast as I thought, so let's maybe stop the project. But it shouldn't have come to that point even, where you already have built everything and then you try to promote it across the users. That was too late for that. It should have been tried and tested before. But
Mhm.
you live, you learn. It has been almost 10 years since, and I'm sure everyone involved in that startup has learned a lot from that experience. Because we're all green and young and and all that. So
I get that.
we'd do it completely differently these days.
Nice. So around that time, after maybe this period where the investor stepped back and decided, the whole team decided not to go ahead with this. Did you pursue any other job, or did you come across any idea of yours that you wanted to build for yourself, or was it like you were going with the learning flow that you were having at that point?
Mhm. So it was actually right at the time when I was planning to move abroad. I finished my master's degree and I had already 4 years of development experience. And I actually wanted to move even before that. But so I had some interviews abroad, but I ended up deciding that I wanted to finish my master's before moving, because it was also free and it was kind of a waste, especially when you move abroad. It can be very beneficial for a foreigner to have like extra education to kind of stand out a bit more compared to local people, especially when you need a visa and you want a company to sponsor your visa. They
Yeah, you
must,
get a golden visa these days in some
yeah, they
countries.
must really want you, and the masters and all the education was free. So I was like, okay, I should finish it. I mean, it's free stuff, so why not? So then I waited for that, and then around the time when this startup has finished, that's when I was already interviewing with some companies abroad, and I ended up getting a couple of offers, and one of them was for a company called Citrix in Copenhagen. And yeah, I ended up taking the offer, and my husband and I have moved to Copenhagen in the winter of 2015. And yeah, it's been 9 years ago, and I'm still in Copenhagen and love it.
What did you love about Copenhagen that much that you decided to
Hmm.
stick around?
Yeah, so when I was just moving, it was a bit of a gamble because I mean, you come and visit, and it's a nice city, but you never know how it is to actually live there, right, and not be a tourist. So what I love the most is, okay, it's going to be a number of things. It's first of all the weather, which is something that
No.
people usually hate. They say it's terrible weather. Oh my god, how could you live here? I love it. It's like
Okay.
it's winter now. Well, it's kind of winter, and it's like 5 degrees outside, and it's going to be like that the whole winter. Uh, then in the summer it's like 25, so it's not too hot
Nice. Yeah.
Celsius. So it's like not too hot in the summer and it's not cold in the winter. Like it almost never goes below zero. Like it almost never snows even. So it's just mild, and you never have to wear like too many hats and everything because it's just okay. It's just
It
5 degrees.
never snows there in even in winter.
Very rarely. Like in the
Oh,
countryside, like it could snow at night, and then in the countryside there will be some snow in the forest or something. But in the
okay.
city, by the time it's like morning, it's all gone because it's
I
plus
see.
temperature. So it's very mild winters and very nice summers, and there's water all around. There's just the sea everywhere. It's like Denmark is on a lot of small islands, and
Yeah.
there's not a place that's more than 40 kilometers away from seashore,
Oh,
from like
interesting.
water. And in Copenhagen there's like beaches all around, and in the city you can swim in the canal as well. So it's just amazing. I love it, like just the geography
So
of it.
anyone living in Copenhagen doesn't need to become a nomad, I believe, because you have almost everything to
Yeah.
chill around
Yeah, the
and
only
show
thing is
on.
like If you
Yeah.
like plus 35 and like very, very tropical type of hot weather, then you have to go to Spain or something. But other than that, it's really
I
nice. And then the people are amazing as well. Everybody's super friendly and like smiling at each other. If you're like meeting a neighbor that you don't even know, or someone, a cashier at the store, you would like smile and wish a good day. And it's just very positive, and people are super helpful and nice to each other.
was the cost of living in Denmark for anybody who is moving there, maybe an individual?
It's a bit high, I would say, but salaries are also higher than in most other European countries. So if you're looking at the economics of like living alone or as like a small family when even just one person is working, if you get Danish salary, then it's fine. And most of the people living in Denmark don't earn nowhere near what software developers are earning. So we are like always in the top 5%, even with moderate salary and not like super experienced, but it's like medium level uh, developer salary. You still earn more than most households where it's like nurses, teachers who earn a good salary, but the developer salary is even higher than that.
Right.
Definitely
Are
comfortable.
there are there tech opportunities in Denmark, like Copenhagen specifically?
Like in tech,
Yeah,
there's a lot of startups. There's a lot of big companies like Novo Nordisk, Maersk. These huge international companies.
I see.
Um, Lego. All these companies. There's lots of huge companies, but there's also a lot of startups.
I see.
So it's definitely a good place.
That's
Can't
nice.
probably compare it to San Francisco or something.
Yeah, I
Definitely
mean,
not that.
that's the transaction. You get something somewhere and you don't get something somewhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, that makes sense.
I moved to Copenhagen for that job, and
Yeah,
I was
you moved
there.
from-
I like that was a role for an iOS engineer, because that's a tendency that I see with a lot of my colleagues and friends who move abroad, that you have to kind of a bit go down in the level of your position when you
right.
move abroad, because the like you have to basically convince the company that you're worth it, and often your English is not as good when you're just moving first time abroad, and for them it's a risk as well. And when they see someone with like um I had 4 years of experience, and I was used to this type of lead senior role, but like in terms of years, it's not a lot of years. And so for the like they were really happy to offer me like it was this iOS engineer position, and they were really impressed. So they basically gave me a chance, and I ended up moving to another job 2 years later, where I became a lead iOS developer, and it grew to a pretty big company. And that was like a
Nice.
proper lead developer job. But I don't think I would have been able to get a lead iOS developer job while I was living abroad, so someone would invite me for a visa, because it's a big risk for a company, and they can't really
Right.
like fire a person that they just invited from abroad. Or I mean, they can, but what if it doesn't work out, right? They don't want to invite someone over and move the whole family, and then like 2 months later be left
Right.
with nothing, right? So it's also a big risk on the company. And generally, like, I've been hiring a lot as well here, and people from abroad and everything, and generally you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't hire such an important position from abroad, because it's just a big risk,
I
both
see.
for the person and for the company. It's just
Makes
not
sense.
nice, right, to then leave the person stranded. So you'd go for a bit more confident choices, um, maybe for individual contributors. But then once you're in the country, then you can go to the interview face to face, and it's just kind of a bit more chill then, because you're already here.
I see. And what's the difference between an IELTS interview that you give for a senior role, maybe, versus when you give it for a lead IELTS engineer role? What is the basic difference between both of these roles? Interviewing process. Is there any?
I mean, it depends, right? So people interview differently. I can tell you how I interview people for these two different positions. And the difference is that a senior developer is like it's a member of a team who is supposed to take responsibility for the projects they're given, or projects as in initiatives, right? Whatever that is. And they should be self-reliant, and you shouldn't have to poke them to do things and so on, right? So you would ask them questions like, um, so you're given a task, like how would you approach it, and kind of see where their mind takes them. So it's not so much about concrete questions like how does this work or how does that work in terms of technical knowledge, which of course you should still make sure that they have some, actually know their stuff. But it's more on a broader scale how they approach problems, because they should be able to think of the edge cases and think of different considerations that could be a problem, and kind of just see the project more in the bigger picture. And for a lead developer, it is similar as well, but a lead developer is the only developer. So senior developer, there could be a number of on the team. There can still be a lead developer. So for senior developer, they should be self-reliant, but they still kind of have a boss they can go to for the technical advice or
Advice.
something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah. But when you're a lead developer, all these decisions are on you. And so here I would say it's probably a similar interview, but you look more for kind of taking responsibility for decisions, if that makes sense to you. And
Makes sense.
just just kind of for confidence, I would say.
Yeah.
Like in the end, it all comes down to whether the person sound confident in what they are saying,
Oh,
um,
no.
or if they are kind of a bit unsure, and then you're not sure if they will be um, able to make decisions and be
Right.
responsible for them. Yeah, so it's more
Because
like,
nobody needs a confused lead, right?
yeah, exactly. You want someone who can give you an answer,
Right.
and that answer doesn't always have to be the exact answer. It could be, okay, we need to research that. Let's
Yes.
research that. But it has to sound confident either way. Yeah.
Right. Because nobody knows everything, so they have to have an approach to solve whatever problem
Yeah,
comes on their table.
exactly. But
Right.
also, that's a good point about not knowing everything, because it is something I look in, like when conducting interviews as well. I mean, both in any role, but also especially in senior and lead, for a person who can say, I don't know. Because what's the worst than pretending you know and then passing the wrong answer like it's the right answer just because you're afraid to admit that you don't know? It's the
Or
worst.
maybe you're thinking that the other person is idiot and he will give it a pass. Sometimes people try to dodge a question by answering anything for the question that they have
Or
been asked.
answering vaguely, and you could
Yeah,
just hear it. Like you could hear it right away. You can never pass an answer for like as if you know it if you actually
right,
don't know. The interviewer can always see.
right, right. So Marina, you talked about knowing things from 360-degree point of view when it comes to senior or maybe a lead iOS engineer. Do you think we can package this whole mentioning of the points that you gave for the iOS interview for senior and lead? Can we package this as knowing the system design, which is a key term that is being used today in the industry? You should know the system design. Can we call that, or is system design different according to you?
Mm, I mean, is it system design of iOS apps, or is it system design overall? Because I would expect a senior developer, and especially a lead developer, to also think about backend considerations.
All
Because
right.
backend developers, even backend leads, often are not familiar too closely with the specifics of client development, and web development is not the same. Like often they are familiar with web development, but it's not the same at all. Like if you're on a desktop, you assume you have network connection. You're never on, on the train or kind of on the elevator, and all these random things happening in the world, or like battery dying and so on. You're always just like building functionality, but you're never dealing with the outside world too much. And then it comes to how many requests you're making. If there's too many requests, like each of them can fail, and then how do you, like, you end up with like half broken states, with like part of the data missing, and so on. Like what if the network disappears or is slow at any given point in the app, and that could be so many different combinations of things, right? Then you should be able to talk with the backend developers and the tech leads that are not mobile oriented. You should be able to talk with them on their level and be
Right.
able to argument for what are the better approaches. Like there's, for example, BFF, like backend for frontend, where you make
Mhm.
a special version of the backend, or maybe it's the only version of your backend that is tailored to providing the data that the client needs in the format that the client needs. Like if you have a screen that has like 5 different things on it, you compose one endpoint which has all those 5 things in the response, in one response, as opposed to calling 5 different endpoints to 5 different microservices. And it's not like RESTful, and it's not officially like microservice-ish, but it's what's right for the client, because that saves you 5 round trips and possibly some of them failing and so on. But there's other considerations in that, right? Then it becomes a single point of failure on your backend if it composes like 5 microservices into one response. So you should be able to talk about these things with your um, colleagues, and be able to talk with it on the level with them, on the, like, understand what is like, what is REST, what is HTTP, like what HTTP codes are common for what. And you don't have to know it. Like you can be an app developer without it, but it's really important to understand these things as well. And then for system design, like what are we talking about, right? Like,
Right.
should you use polling or should you use WebSockets when someone asks you? You as an app developer, I feel if you're a lead, you should be able to give an answer for that.
Right. I think you gave me a new term today to my dictionary, which is BFF. I knew it for other reasons only,
Hmm.
but backend for front end is like a really okay, useful term. I think if somebody has to learn system design in a way that you are portraying it, that you should know not just the front end part of things as an iOS developer, but also you should have a depth understanding, in-depth understanding of what happens at the back end. Maybe it's load balancing, or maybe deciding what type of API and whatnot. Or you talk about the sockets right now.
Hmm.
So how can someone learn and explore this part of things as an iOS developer? How should they go about it? What can be a roadmap for that?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, there can be many ways. Of course, you can learn, read about it, and kind of pretend to learn backend development, right? So read more articles that are tailored to backend developers and understand that. But my best advice would be to talk with your colleagues more and ask more questions, because I mean, there's different structures of teams, right? And you can have different level of access to your backend colleagues. You might even be given an API and just kind of work with what you have to work with. But whenever you have an opportunity to, like, maybe it's a team where you have a cross-functional setup where you're working closely with the backend developers, then look at their code, review their code, ask questions. Like whenever they're talking on a stand-up and saying like, oh, I have built this new endpoint, like talk to them after this and say, hey, can you show me how you've done it, and so on. So like it doesn't have to be a separate learning experience. It can be just part of a collaboration with your colleagues, and then you will get exposed to their way of thinking, and that is a great start, I feel.
And what can be a possible conventional way of learning it if you're not considering a team to be one of the sources?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Then start with learning about these different approaches. Maybe Google it, like what are the API, like ways to build an API. So start a bit with learning on the surface of what you're using. So you're using an API, right? Usually like a REST API. So start with that. Learn about what is a REST API, what are the approaches behind it. So at least to learn a bit more about this boundary where we are connecting with that other side of the world, so to say. And then that's a great start, I feel.
That's great. Earlier, I used to think that when I asked you this question about system design specifically, I used to think that knowing how many APIs are required for a certain feature or all the worst case scenarios for a certain feature and deciding how many APIs, again required and what kind of error handling can be done. I used to believe that that much is good, I think.
Hmm.
But today you gave me a broad perspective on why you should know beyond this as well, why you should care about that. Because it's a very subjective thing. You may know one or two things out of the whole collection, or you may know 15, 20 out of the whole collection, but you can never know everything, right?
Definitely
But
not.
but as much as you can know about that side of things, I think you become a better engineer overall in that way.
For sure. Yeah.
Nice. I think I learned from this. Thank you so much for that.
I'm glad to hear.
So now let's talk about the journey that you are currently on, Marina. So
Hmm.
as far as I know and what it looks like, you have been doing everything by yourself now. You are your own boss. You are a freelancer. You are a mentor. You have certain offerings on your website as well. You build app for other people as well, like as a freelancer, obviously. Uh, what am I missing to mention now? So over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so one of the things you didn't mention is my newsletter. So I'm running a
I
newsletter called.
mentioned it in the first place when we started off.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'm not very good. I feel like promoting it. Like that probably should have been the first thing I said when you asked me to tell you about myself in the beginning. But here we are, an hour later. Uh, no, I mean, so I went. I stopped my last 9 to 5 job in the beginning of 2020. That was 4 years as a lead iOS developer at a company called Storytel, which is like Spotify but for ebooks and audiobooks. And then I didn't want to jump straight into another product oriented job, which will be for another 2 or 3 years. Because like joining as an iOS developer or like as just an individual contributor, maybe you could work there, for 6 months or whatever, and like no one will even bother that you were there, right? Because you're just an individual contributor. But when you're going in as an lead developer or a manager, you're actually making impact on people. Like they have to get used to you as their new lead or their new manager, and you have to adjust and kind of spend time together and get comfortable and start trusting um, your new manager or your new peer, right? And then a year later they leave, and then suddenly you have to get used to and trust yet another new person. So I didn't feel it was nice to just join some company if I wasn't sure I want to be there for a long time, because I was just at the one place for 4 years. So I decided to try working with different smaller companies and do a bit more freelancing, so I can do a bit more different things and not just like full-time one thing for 4 years again. Yeah, and as I started doing that, that's been going really well, by the way. But as I started with that, I realized that I want to share a lot of things. Like I have a lot of opinions on how things can be done better and how things I don't want to say should be, but sometimes there's clearly a better way to do something.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a community to share them with, because like before, when you have a big team and your iOS crew, like your colleagues, then you can share the learnings within that community at your company. But as I was by myself and commonly working in teams where there weren't other like many other iOS developers, then there was no one to share with. So I decided to start this project called iOS Code Review. It was just a Twitter account at first, and then I quickly turned it into a newsletter, and that's where I share code improvement tips and smaller bits of learnings and insights into how you can improve certain things in your code and your projects and your apps, and so on. And I like to share smaller, more easily processable bits of information. So it's not just an article you have to go and read by yourself, but it's always like a one paragraph of the key insight or the key learning. And there can be something you can read more if you want to like dive in, but you can already get the value from actually just reading the email itself. So that's the idea, and it seems to be resonating with people a lot, with like shorter.
Even I am one of your subscribers, and I really like reading your newsletter every now and then whenever you release it. I
Thank
think
you.
the best part about that is most of the times you would find the newsletters are quite boring, right? They follow a certain format which doesn't make you interested in learning or knowing anything about that more, rather than just opening them. But with your newsletter, it comes with a lot of a variety of things that you relate yourself with, because it's either a tweet or maybe somebody posted an article, anything like that. It's a bunch of different type of things that are related to your industry, which is iOS in our case. So I think that's the best factor about your newsletter. It's interesting. The one word that I have for your newsletter is interesting.
I'm really glad to hear that, and that's kind of what I'm going for. I just want people to read it, right? I mean, I don't know why. I just feel good with like sharing things with people,
Makes
and
sense.
when they find something good in it, like if you have positive feelings when you read my newsletter, that's essentially my goal. I think.
That's
Like,
great. Then your goal has been achieved, I think, at least with one of the subscribers.
I'm really happy to hear that.
Nice. That's great. And how did you come across this stage where you decided to go into that freelancing space and not continuing with any company full time? Like, was there anything that was bothering you that made you, move into this direction, or was it something that you were thinking of for a long time and then you
Mhm.
decided?
I've like by the time I've started my freelancing way of working, I've been an iOS developer for about 10 years, 9 years, and I've worked in an agency. I worked in a startup, in a big company, then in a small company that became a big company, and kind of like different things. And I've been a lead developer in a couple of companies already. And at the time, my next step could have been either going as a like lead team lead developer again, just in a new company. Then I could have gone to be an engineering manager, so kind of stepping away from the coding and going more towards the management. Or it could have been going to like a wider development career, as in maybe I was considering switching to or trying something more cross-platform, like be a lead, go as a lead developer, but on a project that uses, for example, React Native. Like it's not very common to speak of it positively in the like among iOS developers in the iOS development community. And I totally agree with all the drawbacks. But the reality is that a lot of startups are going with that as a technology. And there's actually a lot of jobs, at least in Copenhagen, for these cross-platform that use these cross-platform tools for building their apps. And then if you want to work in a small startup, like as an app developer, if you want to work with this like garage style of development where it's just like five of you and building something new, then it is very likely that you would have to work with one of those technologies that are cross platform. And as I really like working with startups, and kind of they have this like get shit done attitude, and it's a really nice and interesting challenge with making it good solid software engineering, but then not spend a million years just writing unit tests, right? So it's a it's an interesting challenge to find that balance.
Right.
Because like in the like when I worked at Storytel, for example, it's like a company that is not going anywhere. It has its own customers. It's going really well. So you are spending you are allowed and able to spend a lot of the time on the maintainability efforts, on writing unit tests, end-to-end tests, and so on. And that's great. But
Right.
startups live completely differently, and it's a nice challenge to just see how the other side of the world lives, and how it's like completely opposite uh, in a lot of ways. Where it's just like you have to build this, and you have like super tight deadline, and we really need to do this. But no one wants to work 20 hours a day. People still, at least in Scandinavia, they really respect work-life balance. So even the most startups of startups work like 8 hours a day. So then it's a really interesting challenge for me to then, how can you still make really good product that doesn't like crash and has bugs, and how you can utilize the tools you have that are not unit tests, but like other tools. Like, what do you do?
I think
That's
you trolled unit tests a lot today.
like, surprisingly, like some of the projects I work with have all the unit tests in the world, and some of the projects I work with have none.
I see.
And
It's either
I know
there
I
or
just can't
that.
laugh. It's very different way of working with the code base, with these two scenarios. But then with Swift, Swift is a very strong, like, it's strongly typed language, right? And doesn't let you even convert an into a double without being explicit about it. And so the way you write the code can really introduce a lot of safety in the project, and eliminate a lot of different bugs that you would have otherwise if you're not using the features like access control, typed identifiers, and all these things. I actually gave a talk on this topic at NS Spain this year. I was using Swift compiler features to write more bug-free code.
Nice.
And that's really something I've been employing and teaching other developers that I mentor, to let the compiler basically say this is not compiling when you're making certain bugs that otherwise would just end up being bugs in the app that then you only find with unit test or with manual testing. So using the tools you have to make your life better.
I mean, I'm really amazed by the broad, or I would say the breadth of knowledge that you have in iOS, because you talked about, like, we talked about system design. Now you're talking about compilers. You were giving a talk and a spin about that, and we are already talked about the other things which are too basic to iOS development. But my question is, like, after saying all this, my question is that how do you keep yourself evolving as an engineer? Because now that you are not working with a company full time, it is the whole thing of evolving yourself comes down to your own approach of how do you see things, beyond this stage. So what is your process of keep evolving yourself as an iOS engineer?
Mm-hmm. And that's a great question. So there's two things I would name. What type of what?
What happened?
I don't know. Let's see. Are you here? Yeah.
Yes,
I'll
I'm
have
here.
to cut it. It's just my Chrome has just minimized and everything
Oh,
just
I see.
disappeared.
I
I
see.
thought maybe it crashed, but no, it's still here.
No
Okay,
worries.
let me start over. Can you start with the question again? Because
Yeah,
I'll.
sure. I was asking you that you have been working in the industry for last 10 years, if we talk only about iOS, and more than 10 years if we talk about iOS plus web and everything else. So how do you keep evolving yourself as a software engineer? Because now you're not working with a company full time, right? And the responsibility of keep your skills shaped up to the date, and everything like that. How do you deal with that?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very interesting question to talk about, I think. So there's two things I could name. So one is working on my own projects. So I built an app a couple of years ago that was a client for Twitter that lets you see, like, if you have new messages or new replies without all the feeds and ads and everything. So it's just like a dashboard, whether there's anything for you that you need to go and take care of. So it's basically to let me not open Twitter to check and then kind of get stuck in all the browsing and scrolling and everything. And I've had quite a lot of users who it resonated with. And
Nice.
so, like, the experience of building that app was quite interesting. So I wanted to build an app from, like, the very beginning to the very end, including all the marketing, all the things. So not just the coding part or architecture, but actually shipping and, like, app store optimization, keywords, like absolutely everything around that. And that was really um, eye-opening for me in a lot of ways. Also in terms of how hard it is to market stuff if you're not used to it, like putting yourself out there and sounding a bit salesy. Like I didn't want to, like, oh look what I built, buy it.
How did that part go?
It is tough. And then also, like, on the technical side, I have decided then that I will build the whole app using Swift UI and Combine. And I've only used Swift UI, like everybody, like build a settings screen or this and that, and not like for the whole app architecture. Like, how do you
Right.
build 100% like an app 100% in Swift UI? So I have
Right.
set it as a goal. I'm not going to use, UI kit wrapped.
UI view representable and
Yeah,
anything like
exactly. I will try not to do that unless I absolutely have to. So just to see what Swift UI can do, and Combine as well. So fully kind of reactive, Combine based, not something that I would normally do. But since it was like a side project that was fairly small, but not so small that it's a sample, but like still a real app, but just not something like Facebook, but more moderate. That was a really uh, like exercise full of learning for me. So that's one way of learning new things. Kind of set challenges like this, because I could have built it the way I'm used to building things, right? More like coordinators, and kind of use Swift UI wherever it's appropriate. Some other places use UI kit and so on. But I really wanted to go for just Swift UI, and that was an amazing learning experience, because I was forced to research and investigate all kinds of random things, like
right.
how do you open a share sheet, or how, like, the opening mail, and all these different small aspects here and there that you don't try until you actually have to. And that was nice.
So
uh,
that was purely with the intention of learning, or did you also want to publish those applications for public?
yeah, I
Uh,
did publish it. Yeah, I did publish it, and it had in-app purchases, and I got some, like, a few paying users as well. So it was a real app, and so it had to be good enough, and that was the idea. Because, like, a sample app, I would drop it so fast, because, like, why am I doing this? There would be just no kind of
right.
goal. I mean, just learning is like too vague to kind of set your eye on. So
Makes
I
sense.
think I would drop it if it wasn't.
And that's interesting as well when you're learning, developing something, and finally you publish it, and people give you a real feedback.
Mhm.
I think that's a complete loop of how you learn and also grow as a developer as well.
For sure, for sure. And I also learned stuff like, making screenshots for the App Store and the keywords and things. And it was harder than I thought it would be. And it's mostly that, like, when you're not too familiar with the tools, like, I know you can make screenshots in Figma, or I know it's like, sounds easy, but then you come into Figma and you're like, not used to any key combinations, and you just feel like a blind puppy, just kind of poking around and trying to figure things out. So it's definitely how we used to feel back when just starting, like, working at Xcode, for example. So it's definitely a weird, and I wouldn't say a pleasant feeling for me,
I
when I want something and I want to do it, but I'm not sure how. um and yeah, it's a strange feeling. But
Nice.
we need to keep, or I know I need to keep experiencing it, not to forget, how to learn.
Makes
Because it's
sense.
easy to fall into this trap of, when you're just in the beginning and after university, it's natural that you have a lot to learn, right? You know that you're still a junior, that there's a whole world of learning. But then as you learn more and more about your profession and kind of become senior and more experienced, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that now you know everything and now you're experienced, but there's like a
That's
million of things that you don't know. And it's a muscle that we need to keep trained.
training.
Yeah, this getting used to learning and keeping being used to it.
I mean, that's true because a lot of senior developers, so to say, keep coming across such problems where they feel like they have a learner's block. They have learned enough, and now how should they move ahead in their journey?
Mhm.
So having these sort of things, or maybe if they consider developing something by themselves which is new to them in iOS itself, I think that can give them a lot of new things to look at which they were thinking they already knew.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm also learning about this approach of how they teach kids sometimes. I don't have kids myself, but I can see these like different approaches where you either praise someone for being smart or you praise them for the effort. And there like have been studies that when they take like a class group and divide them by two and see how like students do with different tests, and basically they say that those that have been praised for effort, they continue trying harder when even when it's hard and they can't, you know, figure out the test, they continue trying for longer if they're praised for effort
Right.
than if they're praised for being smart. Because if you're praised for being smart, then as soon as something is not working out or you can't figure out, you just like give up because like, oh shit, I'm, you know, am I not smart, or you're just frustrated. But if you're used to this effort, then you know that this is part of the process. And for me, I think it was the smart thing when I was a kid. So I'm
I think
definitely,
for everyone as a kid, it's mostly the smart thing. And as we
yeah,
grow, some people get to the other side and some people stay on the same track,
yeah, exactly. So I feel like I'm definitely learning to appreciate the effort. And yeah, because
being humble.
especially when it comes to the design and other things, like I was exposed to programming and computers since I was a kid, but when it comes to other things like making designs or these other topics and areas that aren't feeling as natural, you know, I can't say, oh yeah, I'm smart. It doesn't work like that anymore.
Makes
It's hard
sense.
learning that I have to do. So yeah.
Right. I think that's a deep, that has a deep meaning in itself. I hope everyone gets to understand, the way you have tried to portray it and explain it. I completely get it. Thanks for that
Mhm.
once again.
Sure. But that was like one thing, yeah, with my own projects. But the second thing that I wanted to mention is the freelance projects that I end up working with. Um, that is sometimes like they are using new aspects of iOS or the technology that I haven't worked before with. Like for example, one project I had was implementing Apple Pay. I have not worked with Apple Pay before. Now I'm working on a project that uses the room plan API to scan like a 3D model of the room. And it's like a new API from 2016. Um, that's also that. Then another project I have worked with for 3 years as a small startup. They are very camera based, like heavy on
Okay.
camera, and they have their own camera implementation where it's taking, you know, the AV session and all that stuff. So not using the built-in camera component. So then I kind of had to figure out a lot of that stuff. So all these things, you know, just pick up and then they become part of your experience. Or like in Storytel, it's audiobooks, so I had to learn absolutely everything there is about audio streaming. And
Right.
that's just part, and so it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's a full-time job or a freelance project. You still uh, get to be exposed to these different aspects and technologies and just have to figure it out because figuring it out is the job, right? So
I think I should name the podcast Figuring Out itself. Figuring Out with Marina. Nice.
that's what it is. Yeah, yeah, for
That's
sure.
great. So what's your plan with your career now, Marina? Like now you're already pursuing the own boss thing. You're working with with various companies, I believe, not just one, maybe at
Hmm.
the same
Yeah.
time. And you are releasing your newsletter, IS Code Review, every week. And apart from this, you also give talks at the conferences, right? So how does
Hmm.
that part go? How do you apply? I think the main question that comes to mind while somebody goes to a conference is, how do they apply in the first place, and then how do they prepare for their topic and the pitch that they have to give.
Hmm. Yeah. So for applying, it can be a bit different. So a lot of the conferences, or most of the conferences, run a process called call for papers when they open up like a free, like open application process where you can submit a pitch of your talk that usually would be just like an elevator pitch, you know, one paragraph, two paragraphs about your talk. So you actually don't have to have a talk ready or even a
Okay.
draft of it when you submit. You just have to have a title, which again could be a working title. You can change it later. So it's just to give an idea of what your talk is. And then the description of it, like what it will be about. And a lot of the times they will also ask you to share a link if you've done like any other presentations before or written blog posts. So a bit of like credibility, or so they can see your uh, like your other recorded talks, but it's not required. You can apply without it as well. And then they would select the topics and the speakers that they like. And some platforms make it like blind, so they don't know the name of the person applying when they see the description, so it's a bit more fair and unbiased.
I see.
Some others do it more like simple, where they just get the application and they see it with all the information attached, like who it is and so on. But a lot of places, a lot of conferences make good diversity efforts. So often they will invite speakers even before the CFP process, a call for paper process. They will invite speakers to the conference and just saying, "Hey, would you like to come and speak?" If they know you already have experience, and they would
Right.
like to say to have, let's say, more female speakers on the agenda. And different conferences do differently, so not everyone manages to get a good representation. But I can see that at least in the iOS field, like all the big conferences that we know, at least the European and the American ones, those that I see in the English speaking space, all of them are trying to do their best in
I
that
see.
front. So a lot of the times I have been invited to speak um, without applying myself first. But other times I've applied as well. There's this platform called papercall.io where you could see many conferences and kind of easily send the same pitch to multiple conferences. So I've used that too.
How does the speakers come up with interesting topic names? Because I applied to, I think, Swift Heroes last year. That was the only conference that I applied to out of curiosity, and I found a lot of people, they submitted their like topic and the description, and everyone, like most of them, were having an interesting name of the topic.
Mm.
So is that a thing that people generally do while applying, or like what's the logic behind that?
Um, yeah, I mean, these days you can ask ChatGPT, right? But before that, it's just like if you think of something fun, you can just decide to go with it. And imagine like you're looking at the agenda for the conference, right? As an
Right.
attendee for the conference, and so if there's like something that sounds fun or a bit more creative, it might encourage people to pick your talk over another. If it's like a multi-track conference where there's multiple
I
talks
see.
running at the same time. But yeah, it's just it's just your creativity. It's like it's your time, your 30 minutes. Like, do what you feel you want to share. Like, I saw some talks where there would be the presentation, and then there would be like hand drawn like graphs and nodes, like like with a pencil, like pretty drawn diagrams, instead of just like boring, black lines
I
on
see.
the. So someone actually sat down and made like custom graphics for their presentation. Another one at iOS WK this week, there was this guy talking about um, security in iOS apps, and he was dressed as a hacker. So he had like a wig and like
Okay.
an old, 80s type of keyboard, and he had like 8-bit music around, and a little bit like
Conferences have been given a
yeah,
themed party kind of feeling, I believe.
yeah, yeah. So it can be fun. I mean, the content is really good still, right? But and the performance just kind of just adds a little bit fun on
It
top
makes
of
it
that.
more interesting, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. And more memorable too. And I
Right.
don't think people doing it was like, yes, people will remember me, and so I will get this and that out of it. It's
Okay.
just you get the urge to share something fun with your peers, and then you
I
just
see.
do it just for fun.
That's
Yeah.
nice. That's nice. That's super great.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I was going to ask you that what final advice do you have for all the listeners to this podcast, Marina? My audience ranges around beginner to mid-level iOS engineers. So, yeah, your advice to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my one advice would be to be curious about what you're doing and how you're doing it. So ask questions and look a bit more into the tools you're using, the other engineers you're working with. Talk more with the backend developers and the front end developers and those around you. Like, try maybe not to be too focused on like this tunnel of iOS development, which is, I mean, it's a really interesting niche and there's a ton to learn, but we tend to sometimes be boxed into like, I'm an iOS developer and all I need to know is how to code in Swift and Swift UI. And I feel it's very valuable for our careers to be a bit more exposed to all the other things around us. So, like, my one advice, yeah, is to be curious about software engineering in general and just to keep just eyes a bit more open toward those things. And I think that would do a lot for your careers.
I see. I have one more question before we end this podcast, Marina, and that's uh, what advice would you give to 18-year-old Marina today if you had to look back?
That's a very interesting question. I would say that things will work out the way you want them to work out, and
Awesome.
anything can happen, but it happens well in the end if you just
I see.
try to stay
Awesome.
positive.
With that positive
That's what I
message,
would
yeah, with that positive message, I think we can wrap this up here. Thank you so much once again, Marina, for coming to the podcast and giving your valuable learnings and sharing your valuable learnings with my audience. I believe you all will like it. And if you really liked it, then do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to iOS Code Review for interesting newsletters from Marina. Also, I'll link the Twitter handle of Marina in the description box, as well as all the other applications that she has been building and she has already published. So do not forget to check that out.
Mhm.
All right, then take care, guys. Bye bye.
Bye.